Distinguished colleagues, I'm happy to welcome you all here. My name is Andrey Sushentsov. I am the Dean of the International Relations Department at our university. Today we are reaching the halfway point of our lecture series dedicated to the Ukrainian crisis, and today our meeting is going to be held in the format of a panel discussion. The speakers of this session are the leading Russian experts in American studies and Euro-Atlantic affairs. Today we are going to substantively discuss the strategies pursued by the US and NATO in the Ukrainian crisis. We also hope to speak on the scenarios for the evolvement of relations between various NATO members and Russia, and we'll try to understand how united the bloc is today in its attitude towards this country and towards time horizon of the present crisis the key NATO members set for themselves in terms of foreign policy planning. The leading speakers of today's session are Safranchuk, Director of the Center for Eurasian Studies at the MGIMO Institute for International Studies, the author of numerous articles of US foreign policy and Russian-American relations. He is a scholar of great experience who often shares insights and observations on these questions on the pages of the leading domestic journals, and he also is internationally known in this field. I recommend that all of you should read his recent interview for Expert magazine dated March the 8th, where he talked, among other things, about the chronological horizons of the current crisis. Maxim Suchkov, Director of the Institute for International Studies, a researcher in the US foreign policy of wide international repute, who, in his position, has initiated a series of very important practical discussions and brainstorming sessions. The Institute is currently an active participant in such brainstorming sessions held to develop ideas with regards to a new international environment this country is faced with after the February the 24th events. I will be moderating the discussion today, but I will also be sharing my own observations regarding the events. I think we will interact in the mode of an expert dialogue and discussion, as it is often the most comfortable mode for the participants. Actually, that is our primary choice when we work and simply meet for a cup of coffee. We also hope that today's meeting may result in good observations and insights, useful for today's participants and our viewers in the future. I'd like to ask both participants the first question, which is as follows. In any situation, the first thing to do is to identify all the actors. Today, both the Russian mass media and the Russian analytical community often perceive the United States and NATO as a single, undivided entity with a shared and uniform vision and practically no disagreement among its members. So, any analytical procedure or analytical operation should start with classifying actors that belong to a single entity and identifying differences between them that are to be followed up in the course of time. An entity may be unified at the very beginning. It may be not so unified in the middle of the process. Its unity may be altogether shaken at the end. So here comes my first question to both speakers. I'll probably start with Ivan Alexeyevich. How unified is the entity now? And if it's not so unified, which are the actors it consists of? Even if it is unified anyway, which are the actors it consists of, and why is it so important for us to identify them? And is it really important to do it? Or the mass media may be right in their unequivocal treatment of events, and we don't need these details.
Good afternoon. I'm glad to attend another event of this format. Furthermore, so it's their halfway point. We have reached a mature phase of the project, and I congratulate you on this. As for the substance, I believe the key entity confronting us is not a national actor. Instead, it is the so-called deep state or the US establishment. It is a key player. Another thing is that the deep state or the US establishment, to use a more traditional term, enjoys international support. The rationale behind this entity's actions can be compared to that of a sect.
Логика действия этого субъекта, она примерно такая, как у секты. Они сейчас построены, вот этот субъект, он, что его выкристаллизовывает?
How does this entity become unified? What is its quintessence? What are the reasons for its autonomy? It doesn't represent definite interests so much as a definite worldview that facilitates a number of actors. For example, the military-industrial complex to do their business. Moreover, these actors are part of the global financial architecture, securing personal career advancement, and so on.
Политический бизнес, то есть личные, например, политические карьеры, продвижение по службе и так далее, и так далее.
This sect is quite mature. I don't use the word sect in a pejorative way to say that they are so bad or as an epithet. This word just describes a specific feature of their modus operandi. It emphasizes their secret nature and inability to perceive differences and make adjustments. That is their strength, in some sense, as they don't let themselves be diluted. But on the other hand, it's their weakness, because the environment changes very quickly, and they adapt to the environment much slower than they should. Their single main response, aimed at meeting the challenges of the environment, consists in even greater consolidation, which makes them stronger now, but will make it harder to survive later on. As we know, lack of flexibility often leads to increased fragility. As I've already said, this entity has both its weaknesses and strengths. It's in pretty good control of the international information space and therefore in control of what's called their international narrative. Speaking out against it from within can have a negative impact on personal careers, reputations, and so on, no matter what kind of career you're pursuing. If you clash with the entity, your career can be ruined at its very outset. Though even a star can get disenfranchised if it falls out with them. This is the entity we're dealing with. It's clear that there are many more actors supporting the entity than the number of the sect members. This means that not every NATO member is a sect member or a representative of the US State Department or the deep state, but nobody can go against them. In line with the concept which I embrace, this is the fourth consecutive US president who is trying to break the spine of the US establishment. It started with Bush Jr., who campaigned on anti-establishment positions, followed by Obama, and later by Trump. All the three entered the White House with the slogan, "We're level-headed, we'll clean up this snake nest in Washington." Because foreign policy professionals and experts in other fields have lost touch with their country's interests and are leading us the wrong way. These features were typical of Bush Jr. and Obama, with the latter promising a big change in the US domestic and foreign policy. It is of common knowledge that Trump also shares this position, and all these three presidents with fresh outlooks suffered a crushing defeat from the foreign policy establishment. All of them didn't want to be dragged in wars. Instead, they wanted to focus on the issues of primary importance. For some of them, it was the domestic agenda, for others, foreign policy. But the result was that all of them, except Trump, unleashed new wars. As for Trump, he couldn't finish the war he wanted to put an end to, the war in Afghanistan. He also wished to withdraw troops from Syria, and they didn't let him either. Odd as it may seem, many expected Biden's reign to be an establishment revenge, as his flesh and blood of the US establishment, a man whose entire career has been in Washington, who was a senator for 6 or 7 consecutive election cycles. I do not quite agree with this point of view. I believe that it was Biden who decided to give up fight against the establishment from within. And as I see it, the way he withdrew troops from Afghanistan last year was a full-fledged confrontation with the establishment, who demanded that troops remained in Afghanistan and even sabotaged their withdrawal. The way the troops were withdrawn is largely the establishment's fault, as it wanted to show that the president was absolutely wrong taking that decision. Apparently, after Afghanistan, Biden didn't dare to pursue his course, aimed at breaking all the deadlocks in the US foreign policy. The available data show that Biden has not dared to pursue this course, as the withdrawal from Afghanistan was so painful that it practically convinced him credibility is an important standalone asset, which shouldn't be undermined. During the last 10 years, credibility was the key word in the US when making foreign policy decisions. If you don't believe me, read the Obama's 2016 interview in the Atlantic Journal.
Прощальный он уже перестал быть, по-моему, нет, по-моему, он еще был президентом. Осень 2016 года в журнале «Атлантик». Даже еще до выборов, по-моему, он дал это интервью, а напечатано оно было либо сразу после выборов, либо незадолго до. И вот, если немножко схематизировать то, что он там рассказывает...
This is what he was saying in it, after a little bit of systematizing his views. People, no matter who they were, liberals or conservatives, have kept coming to me and saying that we could not stop wars. Everybody had the same thing in mind. If we don't bomb someone, if we don't send in troops somewhere, then we'll undermine America's credibility. How to correctly translate the word credibility to convey its meaning? If I'm not mistaken, Jonathan Swift wrote a story about a hunter who stopped hunting when he reached fame, as he realized that if he missed, he would be thrown off his pedestal. This is a Akela who knows he cannot afford to miss. The interview in which Obama tried to avoid all the sensitive issues was perceived by many as too vague. I believe he told the truth. The problem is that you always have to maintain credibility. Meanwhile, Biden seems to have been blamed for its breach again. The actor is the US establishment and the concentric circles of its international partners. Why is it nevertheless more important to identify some gaps and fissures between those who are not members of the sect, though act under its guidance, rather than detecting them from within? I believe it's necessary to maintain contacts with the external players, as it provides an opportunity to assess their status. That's why we should maintain contact with them. Can we negotiate with them now in order to reach an agreement? No, we can't. I'm sure there is currently no need for any agreement. The sect will not go for any agreements, and its non-member partners have no power to make accords on their own behalf, and much less on the behalf of the sect. But they're willing to share their views and exchange opinions. For instance, there is one of the groups on the fringes on the US establishment we're going to talk to this week.
Thank you. I'd like to address the same question to Maxim Alexandrovich. What is your take on the concept of the sect? It certainly stirs up interest, and in this context, I'd like to ask you, do we need to pay attention to the distance between the various NATO members while making assessments? We can't see that it is difficult to unequivocally assess the discussion there. That unity, though, is in place, has different shades. A peculiar position by Hungary, an absolutely autonomous position by Turkey. Germany, who on the one hand cannot afford to lose their leadership on this issue, and on the other hand, suddenly starts saying that the future of the world is polycentric, multipolar, and that Russia is an important actor there. These are the points we have to study now. If we look at the horizon of the next 10 years, all this might be of minor importance, and the EU will not be an autonomous player. And we might have to treat them as a full-fledged equivalent of NATO, a hostile military alliance with whom we can't afford any rapprochement. Andrey Andreevich, thank you very much for the initiative to hold these conversations, and thank you for the invitation. I think the perception that NATO is almost a euphemism for the US is primarily justified by the fact that the US is the main sponsor of the organization. The year 2015 had the most impressive figures. The NATO's budget was $892 billion, and $641 billion of it was given by the US. Let's assume we don't know who the main actor is. Let's try to find it out by developing an old film. We need to put it in a few solutions for the picture to emerge. In the 1980s and 1990s, the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the USSR triggered quite interesting discussions among the NATO members. There were three main images of NATO at that point: the position promoted by Moscow, NATO should cease to exist as the Warsaw Pact. Since we are developing a new pan-European security system, that system should be based on the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, CSCE or SCE. Otherwise, it is unclear why we had come to agreements and why we carried out domestic reforms in Russia. The second one, the image that Trump would later call the old Europe, promoted predominantly by France. NATO was needed, but the EU should dominate. And the third one, the image promoted by the British and the Americans is the idea that in the new circumstances NATO was needed, but with a reset. It was obvious that for the US, NATO was first and foremost a way of maintaining its military and political leverage over European states. There were discussions on how to conduct this process. The discussions served as a background for three ideas. The first one, NATO is still in place, but it needs a reset. We mean the NATO enlargement, but in fact there have been several enlargements. I mean, we talk about whether it should be a geographical enlargement or a functional one. So we stay within the frame we have been in, but we change the functionality for lack of the geopolitical adversary that was the reason for the establishment of the alliance. Or do we still need to continue the geographic expansion? In this case, it becomes both a security and citizenship community, which means strengthening the role of values and ideology and embracing the idea of the NATO attraction for everybody. And now there is a counter-argument one can hear from NATO. It wasn't NATO advancing to the east, it was the east entering the west. I mean, they themselves wanted to join us. The second one, a new entity. Since NATO was hardwired to contain the USSR, which had disintegrated, it should disband itself. Instead, this should trigger a new security architecture. And the last one, why do we need a major collective entity at all if we can just develop bilateral partnerships and build security on that? Soon, it became quite obvious that it wasn't really about security. In 1994, Clinton delivered a striking speech in which he said that the question was not whether NATO would take on new members. The question was how and when it would happen. Obviously, already in the first half of the 1990s, the US establishment was aware that NATO had to be preserved. You just had to make a proper justification. And at the time, there were three drivers of that process in the US. The first was an expansionist wing, quite active today, which in the late 90s would stand for bombing Yugoslavia, and in the 2000s supported military operation in Iraq and Afghanistan, with quite big numbers of advocates of this stance among both the Republicans and Democrats. The second driver was represented by the lobbyists from the defense industry or military-industrial complex. The third was the Eastern European lobby, whose position was, if you don't let us join NATO, we will be swallowed up by the Russian uprising, so please let us come under your umbrella. I agree that the dominant NATO actor is the US, which imposes its political will on its other members. However, it doesn't mean that the others lack their own vision or will with regards to the NATO mission. Here we deal with actors' aspirations. In my opinion, the US is primarily focused on the issue of power and authority. For less powerful and weak actors, security issues are probably more important. For the US, the main thing is to maintain their political and military presence in Europe, while for other Western European powers, it was a way of building up their own authority. When it came to the question of who should be accepted in the first wave of NATO expansion, the Turks endorsed Bosnia's admittance as the first new member. That was obviously an attempt to further their own agenda in NATO. The Italians advocated Slovenia's joining, and everybody resorted to the same arguments. If we want security, we need to grant membership to this applicant. The Anglo-Saxon and American logic won anyway. Do we need to study these features? I think we need to. Though we cannot take advantage of them now, it is important to understand these details. After all, for any state joining such an organization, it is important to understand the balance of give and take.
Для любого государства, которое вступает в такую организацию, важен баланс того, что оно получает и что оно дает.
Time to time, the questions arise regarding the mission expansion.
Когда он там про Эстонию, да, по-моему, говорил. Но этот вопрос задают все те же вот,
As the US says,
да, и венгры не понимают,
we
зачем
are both against Russia and terrorism.
воевать и так далее. Поэтому периодически возникают вот эти вопросы.
An attempt to change their focus on counteracting China failed.
Как будто логика жизни их диктует. Да, американцы говорят, ну мы не только вот против России, понятно, что это уже
Still,
the
interests of individual NATO members did prevail.
была в целом попытка захода на Китай, на переориентацию на антикитайской направленности.
The dominant actor is the US, and specifically the group mentioned by Ivan Alexeyevich.
Мне кажется, отвечая на ваш вопрос, доминирующий все-таки актор — это Соединенные Штаты.
Anyway, examining the internal fissures is not a bad thing. Ivan Alexeyevich said about credibility, and I would introduce the word legitimacy. This is what Americans appeal to when they fail to legitimize their actions in the Security Council, so they turn to some collective bodies in order to make their actions legitimate. Their help.
И тогда они обращаются к каким-то коллективным органам, там, ad-hoc коалиции или свои устоявшиеся
Syria is a glaring example.
чтобы там черпать эту легитимацию для своих действий. То есть вот яркий пример — та же самая Сирия.
Authorizes the US presence in Syria.
Американцы находятся в Сирии.
There is no mandate from the Security Council, not even a decision by the Congress, and they claim that they are present in Syria as part of the coalition of almost 70 countries fighting there. But the fact that Finland has sent only a bomb-sniffing dog or Estonia sending a paramedic indicates a nominal presence. It is clear who is actually acting as the driving factor of all this. Thank you very much for the clarification. I would address a question to you regarding these actors' goals that we have identified now. In the practice of applied analysis, analysts put forward goals at different levels. Vital goals for which the country is ready to make war, goals of primary importance, and goals of secondary importance. The primary goals can be negotiated. The secondary ones can be sacrificed as a concession. When we reason in terms of dichotomy, the main interest and primary goal of the USA in the overall framework is to maintain its authority through force, while NATO allies are focused on security. Only Turkey among NATO members is probably the only country that is trying to build up its leveraging capacity. I don't know any other country that is as independent. In NATO, Britain might be looking for a way to increase its influence through the concept of a global Britain. which explains its excessive activity in the Ukrainian crisis. They keep resorting to the metaphor of the Crimean War. Analyzing the aims of the different actors within NATO, we might detect a potential stumbling block, a potential fissure, as the security of Estonia or Finland will at some point come into conflict with the aim to increase the US influence. Can it lead to overstretching the US might and military potential?
Потому что, по сути, вот используя метафору Ивана Алексеевича или Свифта про стрелка, однажды промахнувшийся стрелок начинает всеми рассматриваться как хромоногий.
Is there a potential divergence in the goals pursued by different actors?
Дистанция в целях, которые обозначают разные субъекты.
In early January, we together with Suchkov held an event at the Valdai Discussion Club, where he said that we wanted to give the Americans a rejuvenating rap using our security guarantees that we put on the table in December. That is, it was the test to reveal the true intentions. As I see it, the discussion about the US real intentions, if we treat them as the dominant actor within NATO, it has three main narratives that have been circulating in the Russian decision-making community as well, and the Americans themselves tried to convince us of that. The first narrative, let's tentatively call it the Brzezinski school. He wrote a book which became quite well known about a chessboard where he says that Ukraine should be a kind of buffer that cuts off Russia and makes Russia an Asian country rather than a Eurasian one. Therefore, the US needed to work with Ukraine, cultivating nationalist and anti-Russian sentiment. Many of our colleagues and politicians assumed that this was the true intention of the Americans, pure geopolitics and Russia's containment through an unfriendly buffer. Second narrative, let's call it superpower on autopilot. The Americans often say, Ukraine doesn't matter to us, we were busy in the 90s developing new globalized markets, and in Europe we acted by inertia. The same goes about the NATO expansion. We act that way because we can afford it. And you are there talking about great power status, but you cannot be serious because a state with a GDP below the Californian one cannot claim the great power status. Go off into a dark corner and we'll continue to do what we deem it necessary to do. The third narrative will be tentatively called a superpower on outsourcing. That is, we have no time to seriously deal with Europe. Let states with a more profound historical experience in relations with Russia, which is of course negative, tell us how to build relations in this area. Poles and the Baltic states know better how to contain you, and they will dictate to the rest of the European states what to do. And actually, the Russian proposals on security guarantees in December were a litmus test to identify a dominant strategy and a dominant interest. After all, if you say you don't care and don't need all that, if you say you need rather China than the European track where you want to get rid of a lot of commitments, then here we go, you have the specific proposals prepared by us. Let's talk. It has become clear that the US is not going anywhere. The US has allocated $40 billion and another $10 billion before that. Senator Rand Paul said in his speech that over the last 30 years, the US allocated about $60 billion to Ukraine. The Russian military budget is approximately $66 billion. There is no program in the US to be funded by that amount. How does this correlate with the view that Ukraine is not important? It means all this is not about Ukraine, it's about maintaining dominance in the current system. The case with the US shows us if they are willing to take such a step allocating this amount of funds, this is the price they are willing to pay to maintain their place in this hierarchy at a time when there is a general feeling that they have already blundered, including in Afghanistan or Syria or Iraq. I think the withdrawal from Afghanistan, as Biden implemented it, reflects the interest of the United States, but the overall feeling is that things are kind of going bad. That's why they can't afford to lose once more to Russia in Ukraine when they have already lost in Syria. Here, of course, we're talking about interests in terms of influence and power that come into clash with interests that are more down to earth security interests. By and large, everyone who has joined NATO since its enlargement has given 4 main answers to the question of why they have joined. The first is army modernization, and that is, a new nation was joining NATO so that it could have a more upgraded professional army. The second was regional stability. The states believe that by becoming NATO members, no one would attack them and their region would be more stable. The third was strengthening national defense capacity, which correlates with the first point. The fourth was creating conditions for safe economic development of a country and the inflow of foreign investment. The current situation shows that the states, especially those close to Ukraine, are not getting what they seek. They are pumped up with arms, which does not lead to their greater stability or safety. The question is what specifically a state gets in terms of security after joining the alliance, apart from new expenditures.
Что конкретное получает в плане безопасности от вступления, кроме новых расходов.
One of our colleagues from the Ministry of Defense joked that now we are confronted with a drastic economic slump and a food crisis, while the leader of a major European country, Germany, decides to raise the military outlays fourfold under this shortage of funds. The question is whether this is the right way to set priorities, given the current conditions. Thank you, Ivan Alexeyevich. Speaking of the goals of these different actors, it is clear that the goals of the sect and its periphery are different, and survival strategies for the periphery are likely to imply some specifics and divergence from the general line. Can you agree that the gap between the US goals and those of everyone but Turkey is of secondary importance now? And the goals of other actors will remain secondary for the next few years? I'm putting it this way because any long-term state planning for at least 3 years implies the need to assess the current state of things and to draw up a budget. How would you address the question from that perspective?
There are different drama techniques that are used in literature, cinema, or theater. The first is you don't know how a film or a play ends, but you know how it evolves. The second technique is quite the opposite. You know the end, while the movie explains it to you how all that has come about. For example, everyone kills each other, even though everything has started off well, and they show you what the background has been. Your question relates to the second trick. To begin with, the short answer is yes, there is divergence. But I deliberately avoid the words divergence in goals. As I see it, more important are the divergences in the ability to achieve the goals. That is why Turkey is different from France, Germany, or other players on the periphery of the sect. Now, having given you an answer, I will explain the logic behind it. First, there are gaps and fissures within the sect too. I believe that in relation to Russia, there are two dominant attitudes, both in the US in general and within the foreign policy establishment sect. The first is represented by the skeptics, the second by the alarmists. The skeptics believe that Russia is on a dead-end trajectory of historical development and is in decline. Until recently, their position has been that they need to manage decline, that is, to introduce mild sanitary restrictions so that Russia doesn't infect or contaminate anyone around it.
Мягкий санитарный режим, чтобы, так сказать, Россия никого вокруг не заражала, и так далее, и так далее. В общем, эта секта, вернее, эта фракция, она немножко изменила свою
In general, this faction has significantly changed their views in recent years. They believe that the cordon sanitaire barrière should be imposed, as well as a real quarantine, so that nothing would penetrate in or out of Russia. That's why they fairly justify the current policy of isolation. These are not sanctions anymore, it's a real attempt to isolate. They think that Russia's decline is evolving, following a dangerous scenario. They hoped it would evolve along a safe scenario instead. They will bury us one day, with or without honors, and everything will be fine. History will win. However, now they're thinking that everything is going the dangerous way, so they need to speed up the decline. The second faction is the alarmists, who think exactly the opposite. They say, what decline you're talking about? They're getting stronger. They may collapse someday, but nobody knows when will it happen. So far, they're really getting stronger in all respects that are meaningful for realpolitik. You don't need to manage a decline in any way. We need to hinder their rise. There was also a third faction, until recently quite significant in terms of influence. It was a faction of realists who said that whether they're declining or rising, there are areas where it's dangerous to fight them overtly. So we have to negotiate to come to an agreement, and we, realists, know where to look for mutually satisfactory concessions. In recent years, the realists have lost their influence. The skeptics and alarmists call the shots, and they strongly disagree with each other about whether we're getting stronger or weaker. But they agree that there is an urgent need to do something about it.
Неважно, с нашим упадком или с нашим усилением. И вот они так очень сильно
Anyway, these two groups have become strongly united. Those who want to reach mutually satisfactory solutions are completely discredited, and they have no influence.
Не могут ничего делать. Теперь, что касается вот тех, кто находится на периферии этой секты. Да, и, значит, и алармисты, и
Both
скептики, для
alarmists
них
and
сейчас в
skeptics are not
приоритете не
interested in a
какая-то
positive
позитивная
agenda.
повестка у всей этой секты, вот
What
американского
they want
внешнеполитического
to do is
истеблишмента.
to
Еще раз
maintain
повторяю, у них
credibility,
главное сохранение
avoiding mistakes,
credibility. Это
so
чтобы
that
не
no
было
one would
ошибки,
be
чтобы
able
никто
to
не
take
мог
advantage
воспользоваться
of
вашей
mistake.
ошибкой. Они считают, что на их
They believe
стороне
they have
неограниченные
access to
ресурсы.
unlimited
То есть в любой
resources.
кризисной ситуации они
That is,
могут
in a
поднимать
crisis,
ставки
they
до
can raise the
бесконечности.
stakes indefinitely.
Задирание ставок
From
это
their
с их
perspective,
точки зрения
raising the
беспроигрышная
stakes is a
стратегия,
safe strategy
потому
because they
что
believe they
на их
have
стороне,
more
как они считают,
access
просто
to
больше ресурсов.
resources.
Это, я не знаю, вы, например, садитесь с кем-то
When you play
играть
cards with
в
someone,
карты,
you know
и
that
вы
you would
точно
win for
знаете,
sure
что вы
if your
выиграете, если у
opponent had an
вашего
obligation
соперника
to
есть
double their bet
обязательство
on each
в
successive game.
каждую следующую игру удваивать ставку. Тогда, ну, если за
If
вами
you have
неограниченный
unlimited
ресурс, рано или
resources,
поздно
you will
хотя бы
win at
один раз
least
вы
once
выиграете и
and get
вернете
twice as
себе,
much as
и
you lost
получите в 2 раза
before.
больше, чем вы до этого проиграли. Да?
Pure
Чистая
mathematics.
математика. Вот они считают примерно так же. Их
Their
задача
job is to
вот,
secure their positions by raising the bets.
удержание своих позиций за счет задирания ставок.
And that goes
И
against
это
the
вступает
sex
очень сильно в
truce with the
противоречие с
European
периферией
part of
секты,
the
с
periphery.
европейской, прежде всего, частью периферии,
Their
потому что
main
у них
interest has always been
главный
different,
интерес был
to
другой
have
всегда.
someone to maintain
Это
order,
чтобы
as they
кто-то
need
поддерживал
order.
порядок. Им нужен порядок. Ну, у европейцев
The
это
European
вообще сидит в
countries really
мозгах.
strongly believe in
Вот
this.
сколько уже, 3
For 3
поколения
generations
элиты
now,
выросло
the
на том,
elites
что мы
have grown
сами
up on the belief
были
that
исторически
they
неспособны
themselves are
поддерживать
incapable
порядок.
of
Вот,
maintaining
наконец-то,
order,
научились
as the history
поддерживать
shows.
порядок вместе с
They have
американцем.
finally
И не дай
learned to
бог нам
maintain
опять
it with the
беспорядок. Это
US help,
кровавый
American man,
возрождение
and God
кровавых
forbid
споров,
it,
которые
there is a mess
подорвут
again.
благополучие и
These
все то,
bloody
чем мы
disputes
гордимся.
may
Поэтому для
undermine
них важен
prosperity
порядок.
and all the
Сами
things we are
поддерживать
proud
порядок
of.
они не
Order is
способны.
more important to
Они не
them.
способны
They're
тратить на
incapable of
безопасность столько,
maintaining
сколько
order
надо.
themselves. They're
Они способны
incapable of
сделать только в
spending
альянсе
as
Соединенных
much as they
Штатов.
need
Поэтому им
to
нужен
on
порядок.
security.
И они
Only the
были
US
всегда
can help
готовы
them
за
do that.
порядок очень
That's
многим
why they need
поступаться
order,
для того, чтобы
and they have
быть
always been willing
вместе
to
с тем, кто
sacrifice a
помогает этот
great deal
порядок
for it,
поддерживать.
so they could be
Когда
with
вот
those
этот
who help
гарант
maintain that
порядка,
order.
гегемон, переходит на
When this
позицию, что я
guardian of
задираю
order, the
ставки столько,
hegemon,
сколько
moves to the
необходимо
position,
для того,
I
чтобы в
will raise
конечном
the
счете все
stakes
равно
as much as
выиграть,
necessary
ну,
in
это
order to
значит,
win
что
in the
да,
end
вы
anyway.
где-то получите опять
It
порядок,
means that you will
но на
certainly
пути к
get
этому порядку
order,
может быть довольно много
but there
беспорядка.
can be much
И это
trouble
главный
on the
зазор,
way
который
to that
возникает.
order. And
Чем
that's the main issue that
отличается
arises.
Турция от этого?
Turkey's
Турция
attitude
отличается
is
тем, что она
absolutely
говорит,
different,
что то,
as it
что
says.
нам надо, мы
We are
готовы
ready to
делать
do
собственными
what we
силами.
need to do on our
Нам не
own.
нужно НАТО для
We do
того,
not
чтобы
need
вводить
NATO to send
войска
troops into Syrian Kurdistan
сирийский
or
Курдистан.
into Iraqi
Или,
Kurdistan.
в иракский они тоже там, по-моему, входили. Или в иракский Курдистан. Вот мы сделаем
We'll do
сами. Мы не
everything
обсуждаем это на
ourselves.
каком-нибудь
We are not discussing
совете
this at the
НАТО.
North
Мы
Atlantic
никого ни о
Council.
чем не
We are
просим.
not
Мы не
asking
просим для
anyone to
этого
do anything.
американскую
We are not
транспортную
asking for
авиацию
the
или
US
американские
transport
спутники
aircraft or
или еще
satellites.
что-то. Нам
We
ничего
can
не надо. Мы
achieve our
достигаем
goals
это
ourselves.
сами. Все остальные
All the
европейцы,
other
ну, опять
Europeans,
же, я
but
готов
for
сказать, что
Britain, once
за
again,
исключением Британии, я с этим
are
согласен,
incapable of
они все, что
achieving
хотят,
anything
не
they want
способны достигать
themselves.
сами. Они это способны достигать
They're only
только
capable of achieving it
выпросив
by
это
begging it from the
у
US.
Соединенных Штатов. Поэтому
That's why
они
they are more loyal
лояльны,
to that
более
sect
лояльны этой
than those
секте,
who are
чем те,
capable of
кто
achieving something on their own.
способен достигать что-то сами. Это не вопрос
It's not a question of goal
целеполагания, это
setting,
вопрос
it's a question of attaining
способности
their
обеспечить
goals
свои
through
цели
their independent
самостоятельными
efforts.
действиями. Британия
Britain
считает
thinks
себя
it's
самой
the
умной,
smartest of all.
а она просто считает,
It
что
just
она
thinks
способна
it is capable of manipulating the
манипулировать
US,
Соединенными Штатами.
so they do not need to act too
И поэтому им не
independently.
надо действовать слишком много самостоятельно, они всегда
They
могут,
can, always,
сказать,
to a
где-то
certain
там
extent, impose their
навязать свою
agenda on the
повестку
US
частично
or feed their
американцам или
agenda
вписать свою
into the
повестку в
American one.
американскую повестку и так далее. Поэтому они не
So
приходят к
they don't move to
самостоятельности,
autonomy because
просто
they
потому что они
think
считают, что в
they're
конечном счете они
geopolitically exploiting
эксплуатируют,
America.
геополитически эксплуатируют Америку.
I'm
Я немножко
being a bit
упрощенно говорю,
simplistic,
но
but that's
вот
the
так.
way it is.
Мне кажется, это хорошее
I think that it is a very good analytical summary. Great Britain is probably now becoming a leader of the alarmists, most of whom are located close to the Russian borders. The Baltic countries, states like Poland and Scandinavia, Great Britain as the initiator and leader of this effort, as a country that has just suffered a strategic defeat by leaving the EU, now lacks its leverage and its influence on the EU from within. At present, Great Britain is actively looking for a niche that will enable it to play an even bigger role being outside the integration associations. This, of course, involves a significant challenge. It is hard to unleash a new Falklands War with the possibility of a quick victory, but the British are now overly involved in the Ukraine crisis, out of their league. They are likely to face consequences. The question about resources is addressed to Maxim Alexandrovich. We understand that the foreign policy capacities that each of these actors are building up and maintaining differ from one NATO member to another. We see how the degree of involvement in the Ukrainian crisis is different in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, which are allocating two-digit amounts from their military budget by supplying arms, equipment, and transferring financial resources. Britain supplies far more weapons and provides much stronger support to Ukraine than Germany and Portugal. The United States, which, and you are quite right here, assigns absolutely astronomical amounts. A year of war in Afghanistan costs the US about $40 billion. They are allocating a comparable amount to Ukraine in the next 6 months. Most likely they will come back to this issue in autumn, provided the situation is not resolved, and we will analyze the circumstances. In reality, these 40 billion are not intended entirely for armaments. About 8 billion is for armaments. The rest is to replenish the arsenal of the already supplied armaments of the NATO allies. The aim is to reset the military-industrial complex. If we reason in terms of resources allocated to this confrontation and the support of this strategy, tell me, what time span do the US and NATO countries count on? Are these resources limitless? There are analysts who think the West can afford to foment the Ukrainian crisis on their borders indefinitely, can open up tensions in Eastern Europe and this particular hotbed of tension, which does not cost them much. Are these analysts right? Or is the situation more complicated and they have resource and time constraint instead? When we talk about resources, it is reasonable to divide them into tangible and intangible ones. As far as tangible resources are concerned, it is obvious that Eurasian is counting on the dominance of the dollar and the printing press. They are counting on their military and technological advantage, on something they are capable of producing. It would be the case if we don't take into account the current economic situation and the realignment of the entire value added and supply chain system. All these changes are leading to shortages in commodities to produce weapons in the US. It is clear that the Americans will find some solution, but it will take time. As for the US influence on the global financial and political institutions, tangible resources are exhaustible.
Но и здесь, конечно, вопрос
I believe
материальные ресурсы, конечно, истощаемы,
the
исчерпываемы.
intangible
Мне кажется,
resources
здесь
the
более
Americans have at
интересные
their
ресурсы
disposal are
нематериальные,
more
которые
interesting
есть
here.
у американцев в распоряжении, и это то, что недавно была статья в
Recently,
Foreign
Foreign
Affairs,
Affairs published an
Майкл Мазар,
article by Michael Mazar,
старший
a
научный
senior
сотрудник
research fellow
корпорации
at
RAND.
the RAND
Мне кажется,
Corporation,
интересно
where
озвучил
he made
тезис
an interesting
о
point
том,
that
что вот
the
сконструированная
strengths of the US
Соединенными
designed
Штатами
system,
система, институциональный
or the
мировой порядок, как он
institutional
его
world
называет,
order,
его
is
сила
that the
в
immediate
том, что
beneficiaries of that
непосредственные
order
бенефициары этого
are the
порядка,
first to
они
stand up
первыми
for it.
встают как бы на его защиту. Вот мы сейчас говорили о том, что
We were
у
just talking
Соединенных
about the
Штатов и
divergence
других
between the US and other
членов НАТО есть
NATO members.
расхождения, да, для кого, для
For
Америки
the US, the
доминирующая там
dominant
категория
category is
власти,
power,
для
for
этих категорий
others it is
безопасности.
security.
Но
But
действительно
you
здесь
you
государство, то
really
есть не
don't have
обязательно,
to hand out
условно
manuals
говоря,
to
каждый день
anybody
посылать
on
кому-то
what to
методички,
do.
что делать, они
They
сами
will
будут бросаться
deliberately
на
rush
защиту этого
in to defend
миропорядка,
the world
потому что
order
они
because they are
являются
the beneficiaries to some
бенефициарами в
extent.
какой-то степени его, или даже не, может быть, он им вредит, но они
This
этого не
order may
осознали
be
и
bad for
будут
them, but they are not aware of it, and they
по-другому не
don't
умеют
know any other
действительно. А
way.
предложить какую-то альтернативу
It is very
немедленно очень
difficult to offer
сложно.
an
Вот Турция в этом
alternative.
смысле
Turkey
замечательный
is a good
противосторонний
case in the
кейс,
sense
потому что вот
they didn't buy
S-400, я
S-400
здесь
from Moscow
немного
right
отступлю,
away.
это же не то, что они сидели и говорят, а
Fir-
давайте купим у Москвы. Да, они пошли к
First, they went to
американцам,
the
хотели не просто
Americans because
систему,
they
хотели
wanted
технологию
both the system
производства.
and the
Они ее
production
не получили,
technology.
они пошли к
When
китайцам,
they
там
didn't
не
get
получили
it, they went to
условия.
the
И в
Chinese,
итоге они
and when they
получили некую
didn't get it
сделку у России,
there,
которая
they
позволяет им
finally got
производить
some
эту
deal
систему.
proposal from
То есть
Russia,
они
which
получили
enabled them to
желаемого вне
produce the
пределов этой
system.
системы.
So they got what they wanted by
Это
passing the
почему
world
американцы
order.
так
Why
возбудились,
did
что
the
это
US
очень
get so
опасный
nervous? It's
кейс
so
вообще для
dangerous
других,
for
не
others
только
both
в
because the
смысле продажи
technologies are
S-400,
sold and
а в
there emerges
принципе
a
самой
pattern
вот
of behavior
модели
that Turkey
поведения,
sets by
которую
its foreign policy.
Турция как бы закладывает своими действиями во внешней политике. И вот в глобальном
Globally, of
масштабе, конечно,
course,
у России на
Russia
текущем
does
этапе
not
нет тех
have the
ресурсов,
resources to
чтобы
build its
параллельно
own world
американцам
order
выстроить
the
систему.
Americans have done.
Но вот какие-то отдельные сюжеты
However, Russia
действительно
is
Москва
able to
способна
devise
делать. И
some
вот в
narratives, and
докладе
the US intelligence
разведсообщества
community
американского,
report
который Байдену был
presented to
предложен,
Biden mentioned
там было
Russia's
вот помимо
ability,
3
along
основных сфер,
with
в которых
China,
разведчики американские
to
говорили, что
shape an
Россия представляет для
alternative
США
non-US
угрозу,
narrative and
космическая
offer
ядерная гибель.
alternative
Также
non-US
говорилось о
diplomatic
возможности
solutions
России как
in
одной
virtually
из
any
двух наряду
regional
с Китаем,
conflict.
но опять же здесь в этом смысле Россия ставилась выше, государств формировать
As an
альтернативный
addition to this,
американскому
the
нарратив и
report
предлагать
mentioned
альтернативные
the
американским
other three
дипломатические
areas
решения
where Russia
практически в
poses a
любом
threat
региональном
to the
конфликте.
US.
То есть, и вот это второй очень важный момент, на котором держится американская, вот ресурс, в принципе,
Space,
Соединенных Штатов в
nuclear,
мире,
and
это способность
cybersecurity.
задавать доминирующий нарратив. То есть первым говорить, чего нужно делать, и
This is the second pillar on which the US
в
global
рамках вот этой
authority is
инициативы
based. I'm
формировать
talking about
поведение
the
другого.
ability to
И тут
create a
получается,
dominant
что
narrative.
кто-то
They
делает
are
по-другому
first to
и
say what
продвигает
needs to
эту
be done,
идею,
and under that initiative, they shape the
как
behavior
вот мы
of other
часто говорим
actors.
в условиях нынешней кампании, что там Россия проигрывает информационную войну, такое уже клише.
And then it
Но
turns
если
out that
посмотреть на
someone
то,
does
что
it in a different way,
в
promoting a
Соединенных
different
Штатах об
idea.
этом говорят, они
Given
говорят
the
так:
current campaign, we
внутри
often
западного
say that
пузыря,
Russia is losing
мы,
in
собственно,
information warfare.
и
It is
подарили, и
already a
технически
cliche,
просто
but
изгнали
if you
все
look at
платформы,
what
да,
the
там
US says about
заблокировать
it, you'll
YouTube,
see
изгнать
that
там
they
какой-нибудь Russian
admit
Today
that
из Твиттера там и
they
так
have
далее.
suppressed and
Ну вот, собственно,
technically
оставили все
banished all platforms
Но
inside
за
the Western
пределами этого
bubble.
сообщества
But
в
beyond this
Индии, в
community,
Турции
the Russian
российский
narrative
нарратив
has an
действительно
effect
имеет эффект у
among the
местного
citizens of
населения и
India
у
and
части
Turkey, for
истеблишмента.
example,
И вот просто
and the
так
establishment cannot simply
невозможно
undo what Russia
то,
says
что
and
говорит и делает
does
Россия,
as
отменить
part of that
в рамках
policy.
этой политики. И это любопытно.
It is a curious
Любопытно с точки
case
зрения
in
того,
terms
как
of
вот
how
этот
one can
ресурс, он
deplete the resource and
исчерпаем,
the fact
он
that
больше
it's
не
no
универсален,
longer
как
as
он был.
universal as it
Ну,
used to be.
конечно, потребуется
It will,
время
of
и
course, take
усилия,
time and effort to
чтобы
counteract it.
противодействовать ему.
Спасибо.
Thank you. The next step in the analytical operation of strategy decomposition is to analyze the modus operandi of the parties to the conflict act right now in a radical and offensive manner. They use the armed force in an overt, covert, or hybrid way, or they are ready to resort to it. They conduct active cyber and reconnaissance operations. Nevertheless, we are now witnessing some mixed signals in the way that US addresses the crisis. As they report, they are protecting intelligence data supplies. Also, the US are intentionally taking some de-escalation steps on display. For example, they impose a moratorium on anti-satellite weapons tests or a moratorium on a new continental ballistic missile tests. A prisoner exchange has taken place between Russia and the US for the first time in more than 20 years. This is a classic move from the Cold War era, the best practice, one might say. Ivan Alexeyevich, we also notice some mixed signals in the attitudes displayed by the US and NATO with regard to the crisis. At the previous meeting, Nikolai Silaev made a brilliant analysis of the diplomatic deadlock the Minsk agreement came to. Summing up his lecture, he said that the main strength of the Ukrainian foreign policy is a complete lack of shame. The Ukrainian politicians absolutely shamelessly step back on any agreements reached at the previous stage of negotiations. In these terms, can we treat the US as a country that plays by the rules, and can we therefore expect some kind of settlement and a new sustainable security architecture in Europe that may result from the crisis? Or are we, on the contrary, in a no-rules game mode, and there is an exchange of painful blows that tend to escalate?
I think that many of us would agree with your first option. Well, yes, there is escalation, but in general, you can negotiate with the Americans. To be frank, I would add that you're likely to come to an agreement with the alarmists rather than with the skeptics. The skeptics will try to speed up our decline and its final stage to the bitter end, while the alarmists might get so scared that they'd rather come to terms with Russia's rise and call on the realists to negotiate at that particular stage before it gets any worse. I understand the argument supporting the view that escalation is quite probable. Actually, it's underway. In my opinion, the US is currently abandoning the fundamental unwritten taboo, which has been in place since the Cold War. We are not directly involved in killing each other. The regional fronts of the Cold War were proxy wars in currently used terms. We send arms and advisors to get Americans killed. Americans, in their turn, send guns and advisors to another region to get us killed. In that way, we're killing each other, at the same time being involved in a philosophical and economic dispute on the issue whose social, economic, and political system was better. Meanwhile, we were putting in place safeguards to prevent nuclear escalation. After that, we haven't been killing each other anywhere, even in proxy wars. Of course, there were occasions when Americans were on the side of those who killed Russian servicemen in local or regional conflict.
российских военнослужащих, ну, в каких-то там локальных, региональных конфликтах. Такое бывало. Ну, или, по крайней
In
мере,
any case,
в
there were
Америке были
groups
группы,
in the
которые,
United
соответственно,
States who supported
симпатизировали
that attitude,
этому.
while the
Хотя официальные
official
власти старались
authorities
обычно
usually tried
дистанцироваться.
to
Ну,
distance
как было,
themselves,
например, там, с
as they
чеченскими
did with Chechen
сепаратистами
separatists
и
and terrorist
террористическими
groups.
элементами. Вот я хочу
I would like
напомнить,
to
2 года
remind you
назад,
how 2 years
это
ago, in the
было
summer
лето,
of
по-моему,
2020,
2020
there
года,
was a
когда в
story in
Америке
the United
появилась история
States
про то,
about
что
Russia
Россия
allegedly
якобы
financing the Taliban,
да,
paying
дает
a
деньги
reward
талибам,
for the assassination of the US
bounties,
citizens.
платит, да, за то, чтобы вознаграждение, да, предлагает вознаграждение талибам за убийство американцев.
What an
Какой
outrage
это
it
вызвало
caused
в
in the
Америке
United
шквал?
States.
Что это
People were saying that
нарушение
it was
там
a
табу,
violation
что
of the
это, ну, вот,
taboo,
ну, это просто
which was
неприемлемо и так далее, и
unacceptable.
так далее, и так далее. Я считаю, что это был
I think that
справедливый шквал,
outrage was
потому что я считаю, что
justified
реальное
because it
было
was a
табу в
real
наших
taboo
отношениях.
in
Другое
our
дело, что за
relations.
теми историями не было
Another
никакой
matter is
фактуры.
that there
В конце
was no
концов, даже
factual
американское
basis
разведсообщество
behind these
выступило
stories.
с тем, что
Even
мы
the
не
US
понимаем,
intelligence
так сказать,
community has
откуда это
come
взяли
forward,
сначала,
saying that
по-моему,
they
первые
don't
были Washington
understand
Post,
where the
потом
US
Wall Street
media got this
Journal, или
information
сначала Wall
from
Street Journal,
and
потом Washington
haven't
Post
confirmed it.
подхватил. Ну вот какие-то, так сказать, им неназванные источники это говорили, но разведсообщество выступило и сказало, что нет, это, ну, мы не подтверждаем этого, у нас нету этому подтверждений. Это, ну, это было
It
очень
was a
четкое
very
проявление
clear
того, что
demonstration that
все
this is a
понимали, что это
taboo.
табу, что так, ну вот, ну нельзя этого делать. Мы
We can
видим,
see that in
что на
Ukraine, they
Украине
have broken
это
this
не просто
taboo
вот табу
and they're
сломали,
proud of
а еще и
it.
гордятся тем, что это табу сломали.
So the
Вот, то есть
weapons supplied by the
американское
US and its
оружие и
allies
оружие
directly
союзников
kill the
американских
military
идет и
personnel
просто
of
убивает,
Russia and its allies.
с одной стороны, непосредственно российских военнослужащих, и с другой стороны, союзников России. И еще
There is
постоянно есть
also an
вот эта
ever-present
висящая
threat
такая
that Ukraine must
вероятность
be
того,
supplied
что
with long-range
может быть
weapons
оружие,
that could hit
которое даст
beyond its
возможность
territory.
Украине бить за пределы
That is,
российской
they could
территории,
hit
то есть
a Russian territory.
дистанционно прям поражать
This is
территорию
not a
России, а не
technical
просто вот на
weapon
тактическом
that could
уровне
kill on the
на
local
поле боя
battlefield.
там убивать. Я считаю, что вот
I don't think we are ready yet
мы
to
не готовы
realize
пока к
what a
осознанию
dramatic
того,
violation
какое
of the
это
taboo
кардинальное
it is,
нарушение табу. Потому
as
что
it
это такое
makes it
кардинальное
impossible to
нарушение
reach
табу, которое,
agreements of the
ну,
former
исключает
kind.
договоренности в прежней
If
модели.
they are killing
Ну, если
us,
они нас
we
убивают,
can't just sit
мы
down
не
at the
можем просто
negotiating
через стол
table without
переговоров
reserving the
не
option
оставлять за
of
собой опцию
resorting
делать
to
нечто подобное.
symmetrical
Это не значит
response.
мстить, да? Это значит,
This is not a
что один
revenge.
из
It means
ограничителей
that one
на
of the
то, как вы
constraints on the
достигаете
means
своих
used to achieve
интересов,
your
он снимается.
purposes is
Он
abandoned.
снимается. И в
Would
этом...
you
Да.
please clarify, Ivan Alexeyevich, whether you see a qualitative difference between the supply of Tingers to the Mujahideen in Afghanistan or the supply of Soviet military equipment to Vietnam and the involvement of Soviet pilots in the Korean War? If it's the same thing, why the tentative status quo has been abandoned so quickly, given that we fought against each other in turning points of the Cold War and proxy conflicts? For example, during the Caribbean crisis, the Soviet military shot down at least one plane with a US pilot and fired on several others, which caused a loss of life. Is there a qualitative difference here? Or do you just see a return to that practice with the drastic abandonment of that rule that regulated our relations over the last 30 years?
I mean, the abandonment of that rule that was applicable in the last 30 years, but I might have not been clear enough. I'm convinced that Americans don't even think they can get that kind of retaliation. They believe that this taboo with regards to them is still in place. That is why, if something like this happens to them, they will go crazy, I assure you.
And,
And they won't go for any kind of arrangements or agreement.
они не готовы.
The Cold
Знаете,
War,
холодная
for all its
война, там,
faults,
при всех ее
was pretty
недостатках, это была довольно
symmetrical.
симметричная вещь.
We certainly
Мы,
bombarded each other
конечно,
with
друг друга там
propaganda,
пропагандой
scolded each other,
костерили,
and so on,
ругали и так далее,
but
но
we
мы
fundamentally
фундаментально
recognized a
признавали
mutual
друг за
right to
другом
do each
право
other
делать
what we
в отношении
dared to
друг друга
do.
то, что мы делаем. Да? То есть я
Of
признаю,
course,
что вот,
I'm
ну,
right and you're
конечно,
wrong,
я прав,
but
ты не
I'm not
прав,
going
это
crazy
все
about
понятно.
something that you did to
Но
me
я не
because
схожу
I
с
did
ума
it to you.
от того, что ты сделал в отношении меня, то же, что я сделал в отношении тебя.
In that
В этом
sense, we did not
смысле мы,
recognize the
конечно, мы не
legitimacy of each
признавали
other's ultimate
легитимность
goals.
конечных целей друг друга.
In that
Да, в этом
sense, we
смысле у
had
нас
an
была
irreconcilable confrontation.
непримиримая борьба.
But
Но
while being
посредством
involved in
ее
it,
ведения
the professionals
профессионалы
were
в какой-то
honest
степени
with each
были друг
other.
по отношению к другу честны. То есть если там, я не знаю,
Everybody was
с кем-то
aware
что-то
that unfriendly
произошло,
actions would
ну,
trigger
было
a
понятно,
backlash,
что будет
and the
ответное,
accepted view
и
was that stakes
не
should not be
надо,
inflated.
значит, завышать ставки, и надо это
I
принять.
believe the
Вот
US
с
is
моей
not
точки
ready
зрения,
to
Соединенные
accept this
Штаты
symmetry.
не готовы
They are
к принятию
absolutely
вот этой
convinced that
симметричности.
it is a
Они
one-way
абсолютно уверены
street.
в том, что это вот улица с односторонним движением. А мы, с
The
моей,
way
вот
I
как
see
мне
it, we'll have
кажется,
to
мы
answer the
вот
following question.
перед нами станет вопрос.
We still
Ведь
believe
мы
that
же
the
верим в
US
том,
can
что
only come to an
Соединенные
agreement in
Штаты
case of a
могут
symmetrical
пойти на
response,
какие-то договоренности только при
which might
создании
not be
симметричных
necessarily
ответных
equivalent,
действий. Не
though to
обязательно
a certain
равнозначных,
extent
но
symmetrical.
каких-то симметричных.
You
Вот вы
cited Rybkov's
вспоминали
statement,
высказывание Рябкова
or let's take
или
Putin's statement at the Foreign
высказывание
Ministry
президента
Board last
Путина на
November,
это был не совбез, а это была
when he
коллегия
talked
МИД
about the
ноября
need to
прошлого
maintain
года,
tension with
где он сказал,
regards
что
to
вот держите
Western partners.
напряжение, как было сказано, в отношении западных
We
партнеров,
understand that in order to come to an agreement with the West, we need symmetry.
Мы понимаем, что для того, чтобы
I mean,
выходить
we
с
definitely
Западом на какие-то
recognize a
договоренности, нам
special
нужна
right to do
симметричность.
the
То
same
есть мы
things
точно признаем за
they
собой
do to
право делать
us.
все то же самое, что они делают в отношении нас.
The Americans
Американцы
certainly don't
точно этого
recognize
сейчас
that
не
right
признают.
now.
Я в этом,
I'm
вот я в
convinced
этом
of
уверен.
that.
Не знаю, может быть, вы
You
скажете,
might say that this is
что
not true,
это не так. И я
but it's my
точно,
firm
и
belief
я считаю, что
that
они
if
не
we
они,
retaliate, if we
если
give
мы
a
попытаемся
symmetrical
сделать в отношении
response
них
to the
где-то
actions in Ukraine,
то, что они сейчас делают в
they will just
отношении
go
нас
crazy.
на Украине, они просто слетят с катушек и
They will go for unrestricted de-escalation and say we're a rogue state and we can never be negotiated with at all. That's why I think negotiating is impossible, or rather very difficult, as the only way to come to an agreement is by making an initial concession. Our fundamental understanding of the US posture right now is based on the conviction that such a concession cannot be made. In any agreement, we have to reach an equal footing. Have I answered your question?
I think you have both answered the question and have brought us to a rather disturbing and intellectually uncomfortable feeling that reminds us of September 1962. A couple of weeks prior to the October crisis. At that moment, all the important preparations for the deployment of Soviet missiles in Cuba had already been made, but it was not clear yet how it would all end. Let me remind you that it was one of the most dramatic periods of the Cold War, right before everybody got convinced of a possibility of a mutually guaranteed destruction, as the Soviet missiles have exactly the same flight time to the key US cities as the US ones flying to Russia. I'm referring to their missile deployment. As there was no direct telephone communication between Moscow and Washington at the time, no precise information about the other side's intentions, everything going on around Cuba at that moment was a foreign policy laboratory, and a laboratory of the New World Order, when the captain of an American ship had no clarity about the instructions received by the captain of a Soviet ship. They tried to find this out, making maneuvers around each other. Does the other shoot right away or make a warning first? Does the other fire on our low-flying planes or just take pictures? That's the kind of suspense that had a decisive effect on the public opinion in the United States and the Soviet Union, which in a several weeks' time made it clear to everyone that this kind of walking on edge, brinkmanship in foreign policy is impossible in a new international environment. Although there were many actors on both sides ready to make the most decisive moves. The third actor was the Cuban leader, Fidel Castro, who explicitly said that if for the sake of triumph of socialism on the planet we will have to sacrifice several millions of Cubans, we are ready to sacrifice ourselves. Come on, dear comrade Nikita, full speed ahead. It was a formative experience, serving as a landmark for several generations of defense officials and diplomats over several decades, which resulted in a range of offensive arms limitation and nuclear test ban agreements, and subsequently disarmament and détente. This formative crisis, as a metaphor, is automatically seen as the culmination of the acute phase of the confrontation with the United States. Your observation that Washington would not be prepared for such events now and would immediately move to an extreme escalation may be well-founded, but it depends on the pace of the escalation. If it is relatively stretched out in time, which will enable the American public to prepare for it, then the alarmists will be in the limelight and the realists will be gradually allowed to speak out. Even right now, we see observations in the US press stating that the US actions prompt a drift towards nuclear war. What is meant is to provide intelligence to hit Russian flagships or to kill high-ranking military personnel. Such commands are being made even by the experts who may not have a liking for Russia, but are persons of sense, such as, for example, Richard Haas. There is a negative perception by nearly everybody in the US that the escalation is fraught with high risks and cannot be justified by the US national interests. This already triggers scandals within the US establishment. Now we are apparently approaching the point in development of international relations where we have to woefully state that international relations as a science is still not as perfect as physics and chemistry. In a laboratory setting, we are not able to establish a pattern of interdependence using the experience of previous generations and then apply it to the current events. For example, in chemistry, you can isolate a chemical element in the lab and use it to design a material to make a composite wing out of it. A plane can fly with its help, and you can use that element all the time in the future. I agree that intellectually, emotionally, and morally we're absolutely not ready for the evolvement of the situation following such a scenario. But human nature apparently is prone to get worse before it gets better. I say this with some trepidation. My final question to both speakers is about the long-term prospects of the current developments, the durability of the current strategic planning by both major players, the US and the NATO countries. The US is relatively far away from the epicenter and could, in principle, withstand these tensions for a long time without exposing themselves to some particular suffering. The Europeans, on the other hand, are very close to the theater of actions, and they are directly affected by it. For the US, the Ukrainian crisis, among other things, as a leverage to weaken the European Union as an autonomous strategic unit. The European money is flowing into the US market in a search of a safe haven. Restrictions on the Russian energy resources drive up inflation on the European continent. They also reduce the electoral prospects of the regimes in the European countries. All this creates significantly more difficulties for Europe than for the US. Maxim Alexandrovich, does that mean that the US and NATO have different time horizons in terms of withstanding the crisis? Yes, indeed. The level of tolerance may be different. Based on Ivan Alexeyevich and Andrey Andreevich's remarks about the Cuban Missile Crisis, it seems to me that now there is an understanding by both Moscow and Washington that it is unacceptable to come to the brink of nuclear war. To be frank, this does not rule out that we are gradually sliding down there by the actions that Ivan Alexeyevich has mentioned. In this sense, Americans are breaking a very important taboo. There is a non-linear point in this logic, as for some time it was believed that it is allowed to destroy the enemy's manpower as long as this category of manpower is nobody's there. I mean PMCs. It is an important subject that was discussed after the war in Syria, where there was an alleged killing of a large group of Russian PMCs, as the US Special Services claimed. Anyway, no one wants to bring up the subject trying to hush it up. It used to be a kind of grey area, and in that sense it is interesting to see the response by the US media. For example, yesterday there was relatively new information that 4 US mercenaries had been killed in Ukraine. The question is whether this information will get to the American media and will it be used as a tool to pressure Biden, though it certainly fits into the picture. Though the taboo is being broken, a certain line is being drawn. At the same time, the Americans reiterate that nuclear war should be prevented by all means, trying to sign some piece of paper that says that nuclear war is absolutely inadmissible. There are no winners, and so on and so forth. There is a lot of talk that no war is waged in the cyberspace. A lot has been said that the era of conventional warfare is over, that now it is being replaced by cyber warfare. This is not the case. These catastrophic scenarios that have been talked about, when drainage systems or traffic lights in a big city are turned off and that's it, are not a reality yet. I don't want to say that there are not cyber attacks, but we don't have full-fledged cyber warfare, or at least it has not reached the scale yet when they start actively discuss it. There is a lot of talk about the Americans actually passing intelligence data to the Ukrainians. What can we do in response? Shoot down their satellites so they don't transmit the data? That's insane, given how the Americans try to respond even to those leaks in the New York Times. Director of the CIA, Bill Burns, says that there is no need to talk about it. It's an outrage, and it gets quickly hushed up. There seems to be an attempt made to deplete or drain the resources. I mean, they say, we've got plenty of resources, let's see who lasts longer. Clearly, you won't be able to last longer because you depend on your supplies, while we have many allies and supporters. The interesting thing is that in both during the Cold War and the Cuban Missile Crisis, and even now the US presidents operate according to their three logical frameworks: as a commander-in-chief, a bureaucrat, and a politician. That is how Kennedy acted, and that is how Biden is acting now. As a commander-in-chief, he has to show that he's fighting back hard against Russia, and now he's helping his allies. As a bureaucrat, he's showing that he can organize the process, get money out of the Congress, and get things done. As a politician, he has to think about getting himself and his party re-elected, and this raises serious issues. What is happening is a grave deviation from the program he has come to power with. His electoral slogan was the three C's: coronavirus, climate, and China. To this, however, there were added two letters that did not fit into this beautiful marketing wrap: the economy and migration. Nevertheless, the two topics that US citizens care most about are inflation and migration. Both are big challenges. It's a topic Republicans are trying to play on, like why we're giving Ukraine so much money when we have all these troubles. Playing it off a Putin's price high, that it is Putin's fault, but this doesn't work. And there are a lot of issues, even within the Democratic Party. Some people don't understand how strategic communication works in the Biden administration and why he's going to Iowa. Yes, understandably, he's going there to visit the production of javelins, but it's still a state where people have slightly different needs, and they don't need this story that the current American foreign policy is beneficial to the middle-class Americans, to be sold to them. It's not obvious, and it's hard to prove. As we all know very well, Americans care far more about what gas they're going to put in their three cars and how they're going to pay mortar gauge. So here I don't know to what extent this logic about having plenty of resources to hold out longer than them works. It contradicts the logic followed by the US politicians during electoral cycles, when the next electoral cycle starts right after the day after the election is over. In autumn, midterm elections will be held. Democrats are likely to be defeated in one chamber by the Republicans. Will they pursue a milder policy? It's unlikely. Nevertheless, some kind of internal restructuring must surely be launched. Even if Americans maintain some kind of common foreign policy framework regardless of the shifts, the next big thing is the 2024 presidential election. We don't know yet what Donald Trump is up to, whether he's going to get elected or not. Speaking of the future of European politicians, I agree with the thesis of one of our colleagues that Macron is the last politician to be re-elected. Next, all the Europeans from the current political establishment are unlikely to stand a chance of re-election given the current conditions. That's why it remains to be seen whether Time Resources works is in their favor. Ivan Alexeyevich, the same question for you with the following emphasis. Each party to the crisis, both the United States and us, and even the Ukrainians, for some reason, believe that time is on their side, and that in general the situation is developing according to their plans, and they are dragging the opponent into the crisis that they are better equipped to cope with. Maxim Alexandrovich has made a number of observations that generally justify the Russian caution in conducting the military operation. There is no need in a large-scale reinforcement of the troops, while a gradual steady advance to push out the Ukrainian armed forces and a parallel restructuring of the entire system of economic relations with the main consumers of the Russian resources may entail the long-term consequences for the global economy. In a few years' time, little significance will be attached to the Ukrainian borders, while everyone will know for sure the dollar's share in the currency basket, as it will be of paramount importance. In what specific currency the resources are paid for? Who exactly is perceived as the winner in the crisis? What do you think about putting in this way?
If I may, I would like to make a small step back. The examples that Maxim Alexandrovich has given fit into the category of conflict resolution cases, which show an attempt to calm things down rather than to escalate. There is a big difference in the way this is done. One thing is when you do not propel the escalation to the next stage for the sake of achieving a balance of forces. This is what we generally understand as a moderate approach. It is an ability to reach a balance of power without taking big retaliatory actions. Another example, you have to take part in the competition. You may take part in a test competition, which may end up in a disaster. So you don't go for it because you want to win the main combat fairly. We can compare it to the confrontation of the times of the Cold War between the Soviet and US systems, when we didn't want to resolve it with nuclear war because everyone believed they were going to win on the main front line. But now the Americans are doing neither the first nor the second. What they're passing off as deconfliction and moderation is an attempt to secure a field for themselves, where we do whatever we want with absolute impunity. It is what was said about the calls in the United States not to brag about the US assistance to Ukraine. There was no point of reducing the military aid. There was a point of not to brag. It is an attempt to break the causal links. I mean, to remove the reasons for retaliation. It is a very specific deconfliction. From my point of view, it is a deconfliction that confirms my previous points. They absolutely do not recognize our right in any degree to do the things they do themselves. It means there is a fundamental lack of a basis for agreements, as they do not recognize equality. It's clear that they would resort to propaganda to criticize us for whatever we do.
Я говорил уже в ходе холодной войны, понятно, там пропаганда критикует, но профессионалы признают, что там, почему вот этому какому-нибудь агенту снесли голову? Ну, потому что мы сами снесли голову 2 недели назад. Все, дальше голову сносить друг другу не будем, и все будут живы, потом будем всех менять. Ну, или что-то такое. Или там, мы вашего советника там поймали, а вы нашего советника в другом конфликте поймали. Поэтому...
They have a deconfliction process that doesn't create a basis for setting a balance of forces or de-escalating the situation in order to come to an agreement. They think they have found a very comfortable niche for themselves and want to maintain it. Their hands are untied. In reality, they do whatever they want. while officially they say they do nothing at all and have no reason to move the escalation. This is an attempt to evade responsibility. In your example, the taboo I was talking about did not apply to PMCs with no responsibility assumed. They are trying to keep the taboo at the level of responsibility of a private foundation rather than a state, having shifted from the PMCs to the real fairly intense, though indirect, involvement.
Как будто это, так сказать, не они делают как государство, а там, например, не знаю, просто какой-нибудь частный фонд, да, или ЧВК, или что-то такое.
They're trying to maintain the gap between their real actions and responsibility for them. For obvious reasons, we cannot allow that to happen. Now about time horizons, as far as geopolitical confrontation is concerned, it's clear that the intensive phase may last for months, while its outcomes will set the time frame for the non-intensive phase of the conflict.
Итоги активной фазы геополитического конфликта зададут временные рамки для такой вот неинтенсивной фазы конфликта.
It's obvious that the intensive phase will be followed by its non-intensive phase. We'll see what the framework for it will be. As I see it, the geopolitical dimension of the conflict has been complemented by its social and economic dimension. The US and its allies have been trying to win the geopolitical phase through massive sanctions pressure. Instead of bringing the geopolitical phase of the conflict to a close, they have triggered a new global phase, rather than a regional one, which looks like a long-term confrontation. We have yet to see how intense it's going to be. Why is it becoming long-term? Because the US has failed to convince the other half of the world to impose sanctions. This is a collapse of the US diplomacy. Let me draw your attention to the number of countries that voted against us at the UN General Assembly on the resolution on Ukraine. Actually, we can regard it as a vote on the Russia-Ukraine conflict. The voting outcome does not look pleasant for us. But the issue of imposing sanctions is no longer reduced to the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Now it's a global geoeconomic issue, a confrontation between Russia and the West. If to look at the conflict through this prism, it's no longer an issue about resolutions. It is a question whether to impose sanctions or not. And you'll see that half of the countries have not imposed the sanctions. If measured by the size of world GDP, again, this half has not imposed the sanctions. And this half that has not imposed sanctions also makes up more than half of the total population. Clearly, we witness two conflicts evolving at the same time: a regional geopolitical conflict with some global implications, and a large-scale geoeconomic conflict, which is going to be long
большой
term.
геоэкономический конфликт. И
I
вот это
believe
надолго.
what has happened
Это
is
очень
already
надолго. С моей
irreversible.
точки зрения, это уже вот то, что произошло, это не отыгрываемо. Прежде всего,
First of
потому что
all, because
Китай очень
Chinese
сильно
positions
изменил
have undergone
свою
dramatic
позицию. Я
changes.
напомню, что буквально 3 года назад
In
еще
2017 or
мы, да, вот,
2018,
нет, 4 уже, в 17 или 18 году
Mr. Xi
Xi
spoke
выступал
at
в
Davos
Давосе
and talked
как
about
белый рыцарь
taking the flag of
глобализации,
globalization
значит,
falling
исповедчик
from the hands
американских
of the US President Trump.
Трампа, перехватим там флаг глобализации и так далее, и так далее, и так далее.
China has changed a lot since then, and the current events are speeding up the changes in its position.
Его позиция. И
I
здесь
hope
я
you'll
вот
forgive
прошу
me
прощения, я
if I
захотел
finish our
еще на
discussion
какой-то
with a
очень заумной
rather
ноте.
abstruse idea.
Мы подходим к
My favorite concept is
любимой
that in
сейчас
today's world, the
концепции,
main
что
contradiction
у нас в современном
is
мире
between security or
такое
sovereignty
главное
and
противоречие есть
development or
противоречие между
material well-being.
безопасностью и развитием, или безопасностью и суверенитетом с одной стороны, а с другой стороны благополучием и развитием, ну то есть материальным благополучием и материальным развитием.
We have been thinking a lot about a fusion, a synthesis between these notions.
Какой-то синтез.
Now we are coming to the conclusion that there is no synthesis between them. The West puts Russia, China, India, and lots of other countries, not included, not in the Western paradigm, before a choice. Either you want to be yourselves, then we disconnect you from the global resources and financial system. Or you choose to make access to the sources of external economic growth, and in this case, you have to put your ego and ambition elsewhere.
Будете самими собой, но бедными. Либо там вертитесь как хотите. А хотите сохранять источники внешнего экономического роста за счет подключения к материальной глобализации, ну тогда свое эго и свои амбиции уберите куда подальше.
We have been faced with this dilemma for long. Meanwhile, it has been getting more and more complex and more difficult for us to find a balance, though we have been honestly trying to do it. At this crisis phase of a geoeconomics dimension, we see unwillingness displayed by many countries to make this choice.
Многие страны просто отказываются делать выбор в этой дилемме.
This can be applied both to Russia and China as well. We say, stop, we are not making a choice in this dilemma. If your theory fails to strike a balance to reconcile all this, we'll do it ourselves, coming up with new worldviews. While we were the only ones who refused to do this, it was as if we were against the world's course of history.
Вот начинается какой-то процесс цепной реакции. Когда мы были одни, вроде как мы были против всемирного хода истории. Когда такой же выбор
If China refuses to make the same choice, as well as India, though in a softer manner, we'll find a way to accomplish all this.
А разница в чем? Когда вы ищете баланс, это значит, что вы где-то чем-то готовы пожертвовать. А мы теперь решаем, что нет, мы найдем способ, как сделать и то, и другое.
It is an equation with many unknown summands, and no one has any idea how to solve it. Obviously, it is a clear-cut abandonment of fundamental global rules of the game, and there is no way to go back. The hunter has already made the shot and missed. He offered us the choice. Both Russia and China have refused to make.
И мы, и с моей точки зрения, китайцы. Китайцы тоже.
That's
Поэтому
why the
геополитическая
geopolitical
фаза,
phase
с
is
ней более-менее
simple
все
and it's
просто.
coming to an end.
Потому что она
It will serve as
закончится
an
каким-то
objective
объективным
indicator of the
показателем, там,
outcomes
кто
attained
чего
by
на
various
Земле
actors.
достигнет. А вот
Changes
изменение
in the economic
моделей
growth models, in our
экономического
positioning in
роста,
the world,
жизни,
and in
позиционирования себя в
approaches
мире
towards
с
sovereignty
приведения
and
собственных
security brought
представлений
in
о
line with
безопасности
our own vision
суверенитета
of material
в
well-being and development will
в
make us invent
соответствие с
something new.
какими-то собственными представлениями о материальном благополучии и развитии, ну вот здесь придется и нам, и китайцам изобретать чего-то новое. Но,
The
кстати,
same goes
европейцам
about the
тоже,
Europeans,
потому
as
что,
the
вы правильно
economic
говорите,
difficulties they face
экономические трудности,
are
с
likely
которыми они
to
сталкиваются,
affect
они не
the
останутся без
political
последствий для политической
dimension.
сферы тоже.
Буквально одно предложение
I'd
скажу,
like
что мне
also to
кажется,
add
что
that the
если
outcome of the geopolitical and geoeconomic crisis depends more on the mid-sized countries
все
that
равно в
are
большей
not
мере
part
это
of the
как раз-таки
collective
зависит от вот
West.
этих средних и незападных держав. Потому что, в принципе, что будут
Actually,
делать
we
западные, мы
understand
примерно
more or
понимаем.
less what the Western
И
countries will do.
какие весы над свою чашу весов они будут ложить, мы тоже примерно понимаем.
While the
А
positions of
от позиции
China,
того же там
India,
Китая, Индии,
Turkey,
Саудовской Аравии,
and Saudi
Турции
Arabia will
во
be
многом зависит
fundamental for the next development stage
следующий как бы этап
of
формирования
geoeconomics and
геоэкономики,
geopolitics.
геополитики. За них же, собственно, борьба
That is
во
what
многом-то
the
идет.
fight is for,
И это в
and
какой-то
it is
степени
also
тоже
a
маркер
sign of the
наступающего
upcoming
полицентричного
polycentric
мира.
world. With regard to this debate, my expectations have been fully met. I have enjoyed it immensely. We have discussed nearly all the issues on the agenda.
Если у аудитории будут какие-то вопросы, предлагаю сейчас в кулуарах отловить наших спикеров и эти вопросы им задать. Но пока от вашего
I'd like
лица я
to
хочу поблагодарить участников
thank the
этой
participants of this
сессии.
session
Всех вас
and
пригласить
invite
на
you all to
следующую
the next
сессию, которая
one.
состоится в среду. С лекцией будет выступать Евгений Николаевич Минченко, рассказывая об информационном срезе украинского кризиса. Maxim Alexandrovich, Ivan Alexeyevich, спасибо вам большое за
Thank you,
замечательную
Maxim
дискуссию.
Alexandrovich and Ivan Alexeyevich, for this great discussion.